Little articles that are always there that are kind of the foundation of both journals. Now they've merged into Extraordinary Science magazine, so we expect we'll see a lot more work from Warren in the future. He works as a contractor with the U.S. government in aviation. He's doing helicopter maintenance. He's both a fixed wing and a helicopter pilot. I've hung around pilots enough to know that that's an awesome achievement in itself. He's got a background in physics, and his hobby is studying this Tesla-type phenomena. He lives in El Paso. In fact, he's a neighbor of George Merkel and is the person who brought George into this whole thing. So here is Warren York.
Good morning. Well, by definition here, I'm supposed to talk about Cheyenne Mountain Bulletin Board System and Scalar Technology. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the computer system. This is so you all know my plan of events and you can decide when you want to sleep and wake up. Because a lot of people are just turned off with computer systems, and it is boring, I understand that. But there's other people that can utilize them and would possibly like to have this information. First off, I want to make some clarifications. Cheyenne Mountain is not affiliated with the Cheyenne Mountain across the street. This is just the name I had chosen for the system at that time. I chose the name for the bulletin board system because at that time when I initiated the computer netting system that I have, the movie Cheyenne Mountain came out. Called something Wars. Okay. The other correction I'd like to make is scalar. Scalar is being really grossly misinterpreted. Scalar potential and scalar activity are two different animals. Scalar, as the term as I'm going to be using it, and most of the people here at the conference have used it, is really a process. It is not scalar as a non-vector type of mathematics that's used in conventional science. The man that coined this word, and the reason why I still use it, is Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden, retired right now. And he's very controversial. I've known him since day one. He has some very radical ideas, but he's not a dummy. He does have a very good point, but he is a theorist. He does not take the ideas and apply them. He just spits them out as he perceives them. That doesn't mean he's incorrect, but it doesn't mean he's totally correct either. Any more than what I have to present today is going to be totally correct. The other correction I'd like to make is para. When you're talking to professionals in a scientific community, para is a dirty word. But if you're a real scientist, inventor, experimenter, or whatever, it shouldn't have any dirty words, because testing something out, you have to explore all avenues. It doesn't mean you have to accept them, but you should at least look at them until you're convinced that they shouldn't, be in your realm of work. I recently, off the computer net, read a message from some, obviously, teachers. And they were talking about the students and how the students were looking into para or fringe area science, and they were going to try to discourage this. That, to me, is censorship. If the student is not enlightened enough to tell what's in front of him as being fake or being real, then let him make that decision. Don't make that for him. You never know where the next creation is going to come from. We had some pretty good results right here at this conference, and some of them were very conventional, and you don't have to use any odd terms. So this is the other phenomena that occurs in the type of research that you all are looking at and I'm looking at, and that's the nomenclature. The words, there's many words for one term. There's no standardization right now. So to get back to scalar, Tom Bearden coined the word scalar. He used scalar wave. He's wrong in that. It's not a wave, it's an energy. It's a process, but energy would have been a better term than wave. But since Tom coined it, I just let it stick like that, and I use it myself. And, well, I won't drag that out. Anyway, we'll get into the computer netting now. After the computer netting, or what the process is, I'm going to give you a simplified, and I do mean simplified version, of the unified field theory completed as the way I see it. It doesn't mean that it's all correct. And then I'm going to give you the simplified field theory completed by Nikola Tesla. I don't believe any of you realize that Nikola Tesla wrote the unified theory in his own way back in 1902. And you can compare them. They happen to come out to be almost identical, so in a way you might say I'm plagiarizing him. And then, depending on time, I will try to explain what I don't explain in the unified field theory. What I have done in the theory presentation is I've just presented the information. I have not explained it. I found I tried to explain it in the past and it just confused matters. So I'm trying to reduce it to more simplicity, and that's just simply make the statement. If you want to know why or how, then ask me the question. And that's the only way I can go. I can't get it any simpler than that. And then I will show you some test results of what I'm looking at right now, which is really relativity. And if it'll work, I don't know if it'll work. I'll play a 3-minute test tape that I made when I first had one of my first breakthroughs that showed me there was something extraordinary going on. And by the way, what everybody else has seen up here, there is something going on. There is something recognizable. I don't know if anybody has picked it out yet, but I'll try to describe it the way I see it. And you can investigate it and make up your own decision. You may come up with something totally new that I've missed. Now, I don't know if this projection is going to work right. I have copies of this paper that you can pick up later because it has the computer number on it and all the other data that you may need if you want to access this type of system. Now, this is a hobby type of networking. It is nothing that is commercialized right now, but it is a means that you and myself and other researchers and very technical people, which I find hard to get them to do it, to utilize to exchange data. As you know, one of your biggest assets or tools is references, sources. Find out what somebody else has been doing, look at what their results are, and see if you can find any common denominators in their results. And then build upon that on your own theory to what's going on. How's this work?
You need an opening.
Okay, well, we're going to have to do without it. It's too bad. Okay, where would the camera be? Somebody want to handle that for me? Not that critical. I don't want to waste time on tape and your time because I know you all have to check out or you're going to pay more. Okay, when you first call up the computer system, it's called Cheyenne Mountain BBS, and a computer system is simply a computer. When it's into the system, that means it can talk to other computers. So they have set up a method of interaction between different computers. Well, there are also many different computer makes and models. They don't all process data in the same manner, although it is still not binary but machine language. So the problem comes into being how a IBM talks to another IBM and how an Atari talks to another system is basically the same. So you have to adhere to the same language, but they have different formatting. You cannot put an Atari disk into an IBM disk and expect it to run. However, you can put an IBM disk in an Atari and make it run. An Atari is a very flexible tool, And I'm not trying to push products, okay? But they're on their way out right now. But I chose it myself because I could emulate Macintosh, IBM, any of the other computers out there, which made it flexible for me to be able to talk to anybody on a different system. I had a tie-in system. Now the program that runs the actual BBS is a entirely different program. It is like a little master. It knows when to do something, it knows where to send the mail, it knows when to unlock the codes, let people in different areas, it knows what and what not to show you. It is? Okay. Did I hand that paper over there? Okay. As you'll see at the top, when you first call up the system, this is not being in the net. This is when you call the system direct. You'll get this first, very top, oh, you can't see it, right? Well, I'll read it to you. It's just a welcoming screen. It's called a banner. This part of the system is called Binkley. It's a program I'm running called Binkley. It's called a front door, and what it does is it starts assigning where you want to go. It can even call up 17 other BBS systems. If you don't want to go to mine, you can call up another one. But basically what you have here is the information on who I am, what my node or net number is. If you're in the system, you need these numbers in order to relay data or information to me. And then your second part, where you see the little like mountains there, is mainly my introduction, and all it says is what I'm trying to tell people what my system's about. Most systems are about computers. Well, I'm trying to form a think tank and get people to think and get people to take their ideas and do something with them. And it doesn't have to be just in the areas that I'm looking into. But basically, this screen gives you information on this part of my system. You'll notice that the next line, well, it's not there. Well, you notice underneath there's another line which gives you coordinates. This is because I have a program in my system that I'm not utilizing right now, but it's like a Loran program. It's a poor man's version of Loran. Instead of using satellites to find out where you're at, the computer will know from your node number or whatever you've accessed where you're supposed to be accessing the system from, and then it'll tell you a point in heading to that place that you wish to go, a town, a city, or whatever. It just simply calculates it mathematically. It is not accurate. You'll be probably a lot more off than 30 feet like the Loran is, but it's a toy that will get you to a point. And then the command sheet is at the very bottom. That's what you're looking at now. And that's something you want to capture when you get into the system, into your buffer, and print it out, because it tells you the key systems and what to use. Below that, you can use the system's help system. And the help system will explain in detail these commands. But you access all these from what I call the main floor. You always have to return to the main floor in order to branch out to another area of the BBS. And this is basic computers right now. I'm not really getting into anything that you can't understand, but some of you may want to try this out. The next sheet, if you have that, is a listing sheet of what is available that you can see, that I'll let you into. It doesn't mean that that's all that's there. There are databases there, and in the databases, text can be stored for other people to read online and capture. Or I have a file area where they can be what they call crunch down, or ART, and that way downloaded and read by you at a later time. And that's the bottom half that you're looking at now. We'll move to the next sheet, and this is really the information area. This is the message bases. And the reason why I wanted to explain para is because you will find some words on here that you're going to say, oh, what does that have to do with science? What I was trying to bring out, the fact is you should look into all science, all phenomena. Right now they have the word parapsychologist. You don't hear paraphysics because that would be something physical you could study, and everything para supposedly you cannot find out or measure or put under a microscope, supposedly, and detect. But you can. So now you're going to be probably seeing the word paraphysicist come up. Before it was just the study of psychology or human behavior and how it related to real phenomena, or was it just in the mind. So what I'm trying to do is take the phenomena out of just the mind, the individual, and make it a inanimate reaction that people can actually physically observe. And you have observed some of it right here. Anyway, to get back to the message bases, they can be sent out local, that means within the city that it originates from. They can stay just within the system, not even leave the system. They can go just across the United States, or they can go international. My system has all of those. Now, there are many different systems out there, so, or I should say nets out there, and I have chosen two nets. One is called CrossNet. The other, which has been around the longest, is called FidoNet. It's probably the most popular. Now there's Paranet, all kinds of nets coming up, and their language is going to have to be decoded and converted in order to run on this system, which can be done, but it's a headache. Anyway, my system alone, my net alone, can access over 7,000 other BBSs in the United States or abroad. FidoNet is the same way. So you have an average of 200, 240 people per BBS. Some of them will be doubled up because they're in the same city. But you're reaching a heck of a lot of people overnight. An example was I was able to obtain information within 24 hours on an erroneous letter that was sent out by my corporation because they didn't follow up on its source. And somebody out there across the nation knew the answer and corrected the situation before it became a real problem. So this shows you the real power of shifting information around. And even this information, you can store data that is optic, in other words, graphics, sound, the whole shebang. You're not just limited to reading something. So it's a very flexible tool. I just can't seem to get people to use it. But anyway, this is an idea. This is very fine printed together, but this is just what my one CrossNet accesses. And what I can do is if you're in a specific town, now this saves you money. Netting, you don't have to call long distance. I can locate one of these systems, which is in the net, get you that information. You log on in your hometown to that net, and then all the data is automatically shifted to me or anywhere else in the net that you wish to shift it. That's flexibility. People are afraid about sending messages, they're not encrypted. All that stuff can be corrected. I mean, you can do this. And that's just CrossNet. The other net is just the same. I want to move on here a little bit. And then in the bottom, I show a way of how to get in to the BBS as far as the other nets go. You have to adhere to their rules, so my system has to instruct you what to do on it. But I'm not the only person doing this. A lot of people are doing it, but it's like hobbyist. But it's a very powerful tool. And if you wish to utilize it, utilize it. It allows you to come in at 2 o'clock in the morning from your work and utilize your time. You can check with the net and see what results somebody across the nation had put in that evening before and compare it to your notes, and when you finish you can dump your data back in there so they'll have that information available to them to compare or to discard or whatever they wish to use on it. That's basically a netting system. I don't really think I have to go into it much deeper unless you just want me to, but a computer is a computer. And if you use it as a toy, it's going to be a toy. If you use it as a tool, then it can be a very powerful tool. And the computers are getting at the point now that they're just unbelievable. The things and the tasks they can do. They can almost emulate the human being. Now, I'm not sure how deep I should get into this. The one thing that people have missed, I feel they have missed, in the unified field theory is they have the biggest problem in the unified field theory is that there seems to be no connection mathematically between the weak forces, the strong forces, and gravitation. We have formulas for gravitation, but we don't know its process. Is it a push? Is it a pull? These are valid questions to ask about it. They really have not nailed it down. I say they, I use that very generally. But it really has not been narrowed down by the majority of people of what's going on there. And until you can understand a process, creating an effect means nothing. If you can get something to float or hover here, yes, it's going to impress people. But if you can't explain how you did it, it's really kind of useless, because you don't know what all is taking place to what else you might be able to do with it. And this brought me into what is relativity. The work I had been doing didn't start out as relativity. It was basically I wanted to study gravitation. And as I studied gravitation, I found more and more links between other people's work and similarities, and then I found that common denominator. And at that time, Tom called it scalar. Now this is where it's misused. Scalar by definition has no vectors. It's just an amount. Okay? But scalar, as Tom is using it, is a process. And what I mean by process, what are you affecting? Well, this is where man has gotten sidetracked. The Michelson and Moiré experiments attempted to prove the existence of a substance called the ether. That's what they called it back then. And I tend to stick with our forefathers on that and call it the ether myself. But they could not detect it in their experiments. It was never disproven, they just couldn't detect it. But if you ask any college student today, he'll say that they proved that it did not exist. They just couldn't prove it did exist. And the reason why they couldn't is because they're running the experiment within the envelope itself. It is relativity. You have an end machine right outside the hallway. That can demonstrate relativity for you. You have a mass that's spinning. Supposedly the mass is magnetic, which will help. It doesn't really have to be, but you get better effects. And you're pulling off electrical energy 90 degrees from the shaft and the spinning mass. If you take that meter and you can mount it on the disk itself and have a means of displaying the readout, you won't see any voltage movement at all. All you've done is change your reference point to it. People tend to go, well, I don't understand that. I don't want to try to explain it. Let's just say it didn't happen. This is phenomena. And this is things that, I don't care what your field of discipline is, you need to look at, because these things crop up all over. Well, relativity is the bottom line in all this. The etheric field. The etheric field was run again, the experiment, by a Mr. Silvertooth experiment. I have the papers on this, and they are in this packet that give you the reference to it. I wasn't able to copy the whole thing because I would have gone out of the place broke. But he shows where Michelson and Moiré went wrong in their calculations, ran the experiment himself, and indicated that there was such a thing as an etheric field or etheric energy. Now, the properties of the etheric field are unique in themselves. They have fluid dynamic properties. They are fluidic. They adhere to fluid dynamics as we know them in conventional science. But it is energy. It is not matter. It is time, space itself, the fabric of time, space itself. Now, to go back to our original forefather, or I should say Einstein's theory of relativity, nobody has tried to bring in to the theory of relativity the life force. Well, you, myself, and everybody else in this room, we know we're alive. Is that not a form of energy? Or is it something you just want to ignore? The reason why it's been ignored is because nobody can identify it. Nobody can address it. You know, what is this thing we call life? Now, not something I can calculate, something I can put in a test tube or well, we can put it under a microscope now and show you. But it is there, and it is real. The whole relativity factor comes down to being that the etheric field, depending on what you do to it, and you can manipulate it, is time and space itself. That means you can warp or create time dimensions. That could be pretty scary and pretty complicated. It is also gravitation. If you shoot it in a vector, make a stream, like a water stream out of it, it will become what we call gravitation. It's not gravitation just as it is. What affects it is how it becomes gravitation. And what affects it, electrons will affect it. Any electrical charge in motion will affect it. It causes a slight warp. Now, you know what a magnetic field is, or a flux line as I call them. They are also a warp in time-space, but they are not the etheric field. The etheric field is actually inverse in flow of the magnetic flux lines. And a good example of this is, and I don't know how many of you all have heard the theories, but there is the accepted electron flow theory, where an electron goes from outer orbit to outer orbit through a conductor, and that's how the charge is passed down the conductor. Well, when the electron leaves that outer orbit, it creates a hole, you might say, or a place for a donor electron to fill in behind it and come along. So if you stand back, you'll see the electrons bouncing from outer orbit to outer orbit, and you'll see the holes bouncing in the opposite direction, going this way. That nothingness going this way is space-time. That's the etheric field also. That's the fabric of time and space. Well, this means that there is an interreaction between the etheric field and electromagnetics. Now, when people talk about traveling into hyperspace, if you want to call it, or space or time travel, they talk about the conventional speed of light. Well, speed of light, it will work like Einstein states if you could get past the Lorentz equations and all the other variables that if you have a planet in front of you you didn't see and you're approaching the speed of light, forget it. It's all over with. So it's not practical to get far enough out in space and calculate where you want to go and hit the button and accelerate by sheer brute force to that point. It just very difficult. Too many changes take place when you start approaching the speed of light. But since electromagnetics does seem to have an effect on the etheric field, go back and look at the whole theory once again, then that means we could possibly fool Mother Nature electromagnetically. That means there is another substance that can be calculated out there. There is another energy, if you want to call it, other than what we already know. Now, to go back and explain how the etheric field relates to known particles. The etheric field is energy. It's fluidic. When it's in motion, it's a little vortice, a high velocity vortice of energy, like a toroidal donut that starts to accelerate and oscillate very minutely. This can be calculated. It takes the form and the shape, if you look at it as it oscillates back and forth, and the field goes out and down, out and down. It looks like a spring in one oscillation, but if it takes a complete cycle, it'll look like a spheroid. Now, you have a spheroid piece of energy, which Merkel, George Merkel, coins it the scroll, so I'll give him that credit because that belongs to him. And this is why when I met him, it just opened up doors because he had taken me lower than I was able to go. This made me to the point where I could explain what was happening in nature. And now I'm setting out with small experiments to try to prove it. And it's going by leaps and bounds, unfortunately, and we don't really have the proper equipment to do it. We're doing it in a very unconventional manner. But anyway, picture this swirling spheroid of energy. That's one scroll. Now it takes, and Dr. Merkel will have to give you, he wants to be called George. George will have to give you the actual calculations on how he calculated this, but he predicted that it takes 918 scrolls interwoven among themselves, and it now becomes what we call a photon. A photon is still energy. Okay? But now we can start to perceive something in our dimension with a photon. Now it takes another 918 photons and it becomes an electron. Now that is the conversion right there from energy to matter. That's EMC squared. You now have something that can be measured, can be detected, can be calculated. And all the other particles, depending on how the scroll configuration falls into place, actually, you'll need this sheet over there too. How it falls into place is dependent upon the scroll arrangement, but there's not enough information on that yet. We just barely even scratched the surface on all of this. I did forget one important byline, and this is not a plug either, but because the people have been so gracious to me, I want to mention their names. And I apologize for jumping back. But on the computer system, I have journals, magazines, and other references that are available to people. They supply me free with their issues, and I pass that information on their issues on to the users of my system. And I just want to mention the people that are actually in there now. There's Raman and Zyke, which you probably are aware of. They're a fairly decent journal for a lot of this information that is hard to find. There is a technical one, strictly in electronics, that has devices similar to your gravitational device, has been in there, but it's more common devices also, called Ectar Electronics USA. And then there's the latest one, which I found very intriguing because it goes into the inventors or into the person they're talking about's history. It gives you a little insight on the person himself, not just what he was doing. And that is Electric Spacecraft Journal. That's theirs. And that's the other electronic one. Roman and Zyke. Okay. Back to where I was on theory of relativity. Anyway, now at this point you have your conversion, but nobody has been able to tie in the unified field theory, the life force. Nobody's even mentioned it because they couldn't even identify it or address it. Well, from the work that George has done, the life force is also the etheric field. It actually comes in through the poles of the spinning electrons, protons, etc. Now, you can photograph this force. And as I say, you don't have to take my word for it. But something unusual is going on here. And I owe a great deal to a Dr. Bark at RCA Labs in Switzerland. He sent me this data and requested some data in return, and I, as of yet, after 2 years, been able to get it to him. So I know he wants to choke me to death, but I will try to get that obligation caught up. Here you will find one of the photographs he sent. That is a bar magnet that you see on the front of the screen. The distortion patterns you see around the end don't adhere to normal, what you would consider a flux field from a magnet. Normally, you would see it go out and around. But you're not seeing that in this case. You're seeing two toroidal shapes going this way and this way. And by definition, from what Matt Campbell, myself, and several other people had calculated, it should have taken this shape form. And we didn't have this information when we did our calculations, and it matched up to our calculations.
And how did he generate that?
I'll get into that in a minute. I don't think you can see this either, but this was my calculation, which is an extraordinary science if you want to review it, and it shows the same toroidal pattern. Matt's had the same thing. I don't have it with me. Now, I found another gentleman that was using the back door for the study of gravitation. He was studying the falling bodies. He happened to have gotten injured in a gravitational experiment, and that's where he's at right now. He got his back fairly well messed up, but he was studying his theory, and he got everything in his lab supposedly to float around, and he got struck in the back, and he got injured. But this is his drawing on what he was doing. Now, we had no correlation between any of us, and he comes up with the exact same pattern, identical pattern. So that means 3 of us at least are seeing something unusual, something going on. And it's elusive because it rides within the magnetic field. You have to know what you're looking for to look for it. And one of the neatest things I've seen yet was a videotape on 2 physicists, one from the US and one from Russia, that were trying to study gravitation. And the videotape has computer animation of trying to depict what a gravitational field is. And they relate to, on a linear plane, they relate to the old water on the pond theory. You throw a pebble in, you get a wave out. And you have these 2 physicists standing there, one's US and one's Russia, and they're looking at this wave and they're looking for a possible graviton or a possible tachyon. Now, the experiment was demonstrated as being a water wave. Now, let's just say instead of gravity, let's call it water. Are we going to be looking for a water molecule or a water wave? You build your equipment to look for what you're looking for. So if they're going to look for a graviton, they're going to try to find a scroll. They're not going to find it because it's part of the complete system. They need to look for the gravity wave. They need to look for an etheric wave. And that is what some of this equipment is detecting, disturbance in the etheric field. And remember, it is fluidic. And it adheres to the conventional fluidic properties. And to jump on, because I see I am running short on time here, because I want to read Nikola Tesla's. I'm just explaining my unified field theory right now. I lost her. Okay, so I wanted to go into a little bit deeper on what gravity was itself in relationship to the etheric field. Supposedly this, let's just say this etheric field does exist. I have no doubt it does. Let's say you can take it and structure it. Okay, let's say we're able to structure it through a sequence of specifically wound coils and electromagnetics as we know it today, and create a flow. Well, how does that relate to what we know as gravity? Well, the proton and the electron spins affect the etheric field. So they only affect it slightly. They don't affect it fully, which means they warp it just slightly. So how nature creates gravitation is you have a mass, this ball Earth we're living on, and it has trillions upon trillions of atoms which have their orbits, which have electrons, which each electron is affecting the etheric field in some manner. Just slightly, but it is. You get further out in space and you get away from this mass, and the etheric field is fluidic. You're away from the ocean. Take a spinning ball and put it on the water. You spin it up, water's going to adhere to the skin of that ball and fly off, but not all the water. Just what adheres to the spin from the friction, it's grabbed off the surface of the ball. That was what the electrons spinning are doing to the etheric field. They're grabbing the etheric field and they're bending it slightly. If you have all these spinning rotations, doesn't matter what axes they're in, eventually the flow is going to go toward the center of all the spinning axes. And since it's energy, you can pump as much as you want to in the center because you can't measure it. It's pure energy. So you're going to have this flow of etheric field going toward the center of mass where there's matter. And if you're on the surface where that flow is picked up and starting to go in, it's just like water. You're going to be pulled along with it. But you're being pulled because within the atom structure there's a thing called neutrons. This is what really density is, as you all know. But it's a happy particle. It's neutral. It's neutral because of the way it's spinning. And it identifies with the etheric field. It locks into the etheric field just like a gyro locks into time and space. So when it starts to move, it wants to move with the etheric field. Consequently, all the other atom structures are pulled along with it. So the electrons are not what's pulling you along. It's the neutrons that pull matter along into the etheric field that we perceive as gravity. So that is how the etheric field becomes gravity. How does it become life force? Well, Merkel can probably explain it further than I can, but the crystals have been found to align the spin of photons. And remember, photons are scrolls. Scrolls is the etheric field in motion. So now we have a conversion link once again. They don't align electrons, so you can have a crystal structure with an etheric field around it with no means of detecting it because you don't know what you're trying to detect. And you can have a magnet with a magnetic field around it, but you also have an etheric field around that one, which is inverse. You won't have a magnetic field around the crystal. On Merkel's tape, we have videotaped the actual forces from this field. They are not electrostatic, although the term used is real close. You can call them electrostatic. They are not electromagnetic in nature. But they did align the crystals just like a bar magnet would. They linked up, and in his case, they fused together. If you want to run a test on that, you're welcome to. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there's another field out there that needs to be explored. It's very little known about it. Now, to go into Nikola Tesla's unified field theory, this is a paper he wrote April 21st, 1908. I'm sorry, I said 1902. And I'll just read his paper, and we'll relate it to what I just said. I'll reiterate on what I feel he is saying. You all can take it and read it in your own manner if you wish to study what he had written. He states, every ponderable atom is differentiated from a tenuous fluid. This fluid, I've already stated, was etheric. It is fluid, fluidic properties, filling all space merely by spinning motion as a whirl of water in a calm lake. The scroll, the spinning motion, that is when the fluid is in motion. By being set in movement, this fluid, the ether, he calls it by name, becomes gross matter. That is where it goes into photon and then converts into an electron. It now becomes matter, physical matter. Its movement arrested, the primary substance reveals its normal state. In other words, it's elastic, which is part of a fluidic property, also of a magnetic property. It wants to spring back once you shut off the power source. In this case, it wants to spring back once its offset has ceased, whatever that offset may be. And there are many different ways of affecting the etheric field. Scalar is only one of them. It's only a process. The normal state here is one of stillness, where radiation then goes after its timeline as matter, he observes. That is how RF is transmitted through time and space. That is also talking about the possibilities of time travel or hyperspace. That's where time or matter goes after its delta 1 to delta 2. It's made a change. It's become perceivable. He also goes on to say, it appears then possibly for man, through harnessing energy of the medium and suitable agencies for starting and stopping etheric swirls or whirls, to cause matter to form or disappear. That sounds almost like the supposable Philadelphia experiment. But as scientists, you're not supposed to look into that because it doesn't exist. At his command, meaning man's command, almost without effort on his part, old worlds would vanish and new ones would spring up into being. He could alter the size of this planet, control of its seasons, adjust its distance from the sun, guide it on its internal journey along the path he might choose through the depths of the universe. He could make planets collide and produce its suns and stars, its heat, its light. He could originate life in all its infinite forms. This seems to me what George Merkel has stumbled across. To cause it at will, the birth and death of matter, would be man's greatest deed, which would make him the mastery of physical creation, would make him fulfill his ultimate destiny, Mr. Tesla. And I felt that that was fitting to put into this conference, since it is run by Tesla. So it pays to go back and look at other people's work and their thoughts and what they were doing. I have one real quick word of closing here. I find my notes. It's a caution, warning, that when you find some of these new properties, you have obligations that go along with them. Just as George and I had, and I don't want to take credit for his work, but just as George has is in the genetic end of it, it's not something you just want to unleash openly. It has some detrimental properties to it, and those do need to be secured by the proper agencies, by the proper people. What I'm trying to say is you financiers, you other scientists in your own disciplines need to go to work instead of just going to an 8-to-5 job, because the researcher has to be free to do his research. Let the people that set the economy structures up and the money flow handle their work that they do the best. So it means people have to do their own job instead of just being complacent and going from 8 to 5 and, you know, writing out life. In the cloning aspect alone, the legislators are going to have to go to work. I had a young lady come to me. She was a nurse, not my roommate, but she was a nurse, and she saw what was happening, and she says, gee, that means now we can clone people to go to war. And I go, wow. It's totally misunderstood. And I know if one person misunderstands, more people are going to misunderstand. Cloning would be, and this is pure cloning, this is not the way people are doing it today. They're doing it by splicing to a bacteria and attaching. That's not pure cloning. In fact, that's dangerous. But this is pure cloning, and if that possibly can be done, which I assure you it can be done, then that means we can bring in a whole new species of people, but they have to be protected because there's no legislation for them right now. Somebody can say, well, you're inferior because you weren't born normally. They were born just simply by a new process. They're identical to the clone they came from, but they are an individual. Their sole entity is themselves. They are a person, and they have a right to that. They should not be brought into slavery because they are different in some way. And man tends to, over the history, take any difference and want to say, hey, I'm better than you are. And we're on this whole ball together. And Tesla is definitely a genius because he had come up with the ultimate weapon. And if we don't realize the work he has done, then by his work alone, his pneumatic vibrator, it makes the Earth a weapon itself. The Earth would literally fly apart. And if Tesla could come up with it, eventually other people are going to understand this. And that is an ultimate weapon, and suicide, to me, is no answer. I can't think of anything else. I know I've run out of time, but that basically is what I had to cover real roughly. If there's any questions, I'll entertain those. I want to leave you with one thought from Captain Kirk on Starship Enterprise, and that's get a life.